Hello everybody and welcome to the Ozone. Today we are beginning the audiobook for Five Nights at Freddy's Fazbear Frights number 5. 5 already? Bunny Call. So this came out today and I am so excited to read it. No idea what it's going to be about. We're going to read the first story today. Yeah. You're going to see my reaction, of course. I have never read this before. So I'm going to be reacting to it with you, and yeah, we're going to see what a massive lore reveals are going to be in this one. Anyway, let's begin. Bunny Call. As you can see, we got three again. Bunny Call in the Flesh. That's a good title. And the Man in Room 1280 or 1280. I don't know. 1280. The Man in Room 1280. That's the one I'm most excited about. I think everybody else is the same. Anyway, here we are, Bunny Call. This one's about Bob. Don't know much about it, but we'll just get straight into it. The sun erupted from behind low-hanging grey clouds and nearly blinded Bob. He squinted, glowed, and flipped down the visor as he slowed to maneuver his anemic minivan around the millionth sharp curve on this seemingly endless winding road carving its way through thickly forested mountains. That's just great, Bob thought. The only thing he'd been looking forward to about this trip was the predicted rainy weather. His family was bummed about it, but he was secretly gleeful. Rain meant the flurry of activities would be cancelled and he'd be left in peace to do a little fishing, take naps, and read a book. "Honey, look at that," Bob's wife, Wanda, sang out. "Sun. Oh, is that what that is?" She playfully smacked his shoulder. "Hand me my sunglasses," Bob said. Bob took his eyes from the road for a couple seconds and watched Wanda lean forward to dig the sunglasses out of the glove box. He admired her shiny auburn curls and the soft contours of her profile. Wanda was petite, pale, and freckled, with small features. Even after 12 years of marriage and 3 kids, she was still the pretty, perky cheerleader he'd fallen for when they were seniors in high school. The only noticeable difference was her clothes, having traded her pom-poms and pleated skirts for the latest fashion. Today, she was wearing high-waist short black shorts and a nettled lavender top over her black tank. The top fell off one shoulder. It looked great. Eyes back on the road, Bob put on the sunglasses. Then he took a couple of seconds to check himself out in the rearview mirror. A couple seconds was all it took to confirm that he didn't look like the jock he'd been in high school. Gone were the long, thick black hair, the sharp jawline, the mischievous dark brown eyes, and the wide, carefree grin. In their place were thinning, greying short hair, soft jowls, tired eyes, and lips clammed into a downward curve. Most of his muscles had gone wherever too much of his hair had gone. He didn't have enough time to work out, and it showed. Bob quickly shifted his attention to the drive. He pulled the minivan into the right lane as the road started climbing upward, and the 2 lanes turned into 3, creating a passing line. 2 sporty sedans pulled out from behind Bob to zip right by. I swear sedans are mentioned in every story. What is it with sedans? Bob sighed. "I miss my MG." Wanda glanced at him, but wouldn't take the bait. She never did. She'd talked him into selling his beloved MG when they had their second child. He'd regretted it ever since. He missed everything about that car, even its smell, the distinct motor oil or leather seat smell that always made him feel manly and young. Bob shook his head and tried not to inhale the scents of the minivan, peanut butter, dirty socks, and grape juice. "Guess what, everyone?" Wanda called out. "What?" the kids chorused. "They've changed the forecast." Wanda did a happy little dance in her seat as she looked at her phone screen. Bob was surprised the phone still had service. It felt like they were thousands of miles from civilization. "Instead of 80% chance of steady rain," Wanda said, "it now says 20%. We're gonna have sun. Happy sun, smiling sun, some cat out to play." Bob's 3-year-old daughter Cindy began singing off-key. Bright sun, friendly sun, it's a beautiful day. Wanda joined in with Cindy. Cindy giggled and started in on the grating melody again. Her curly auburn pigtails bounced as she bopped through the song. What Cindy lacked in singing talent, she made up for in cuteness and enthusiasm. Freckles and a happy grin won over everyone who met her. Come on, let's all sing, Wanda called out. 7-year-old Aaron sat next to Cindy. In the car seat he was excited to be growing out of soon. He shared his sister's freckles and auburn hair as well as their energy, and predictably joined in singing. Tyler, 10, lanky and dark with broad shoulders that telegraphed the athletic build he'd have soon, lounged in his own space in the third row of seats. Tyler liked to set himself apart because he was the oldest, but he was still young enough to be wanted included into the family fun. He still loved game night, movie night, Sunday picnics and sing-alongs. Now, he did this part by providing a beatbox backup. A happy sun, smiling sun, sun come out to play. Bob's family sang. Come on, Bob, Wanda cajoled. Sing, I've never seen that word. Bob grunted, then ground his teeth while his family went through the 2 lines at least half a dozen times. Give me some classic rock and I'd belt out with the best of them, Bob thought. But he wasn't going to sing out about the stinking sun. Bob kept his lips pressed together and his eyes on the road, where the still wet pavement was glistening in the newly shining sun. The double yellow line was a tether, pulling the minivan inexorably towards its destination. Bob might be driving, but he had no control. Not really. When was the last time he'd had control? Before Tyler was born? When he and Wanda married? Before they met? Since he was born? Was control an illusion? Finally, the song wound down, and Aaron asked the age-old question. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Cindy parroted. How much further? Are we there yet? Wanda asked Bob. Not you too, Bob said with a sigh. Wanda laughed. She looked at the map she had unfolded, and answered her own question. 27 more miles, she said. Bob found it endearing how Wanda insisted map reading was more fun than using a GPS. It was one of the many quirks he loved about her. Making up songs like the Dumb Sun song, that's really hard to say, Dumb Sun song, was one of the many quirks he wasn't so crazy about. Harping continually on family togetherness was one of the quirks he truly hated. When Tyler had been young, it wasn't so bad. Taking his son on fishing trips and to ball games was no trouble at all. Even the hikes Wanda had planned were fun. When Aaron was born, the family activities had gotten more complicated, but they had still been doable. Adding Cindy to the mix had raised the chaos factor tenfold. Cindy wasn't a brat or anything, she was actually a very sweet child, but her energy level was through the roof, and for some reason, all that did was amp up the boys. Lately, it seemed like Bob had never got any peace or quiet, even at night. He could be sure that one or more of his kids would end up diving into bed with Wanda and him at some point, every night, without fail. Where Bob used to have time to himself, now his time belonged to everyone except him. His work took a slice, his kids took a slice, Wanda took a slice. He never used to begrudge the time Wanda took, but that was because she wanted his time for fun things. Now all she wanted was for him to put on one of his many family man hats. Coach, teacher, playmate, cook, handyman, driver, shopper, janitor, money earner. A couple months before, Wanda's best friend had told Wanda about Camp Etenia. Etenia is a Native American name that means rich. Wanda read from the nearly magazine-thick brochure describing the place. We named our family inclusive Camp Etenia because a man who has family is indeed rich. She kept reading. Isn't that beautiful, Bob? He said absently. Bob had thought Wanda was just reading about the place the same way she read about Greenland and Norway and Albania. Wanda wanted to travel, and she loved to research destinations, but it turned out Wanda was serious about Camp Etenia. I keep saying Etenia. Why don't we just send the kids to camp, and we can stay home and hang out in the hammock? Bob asked while Wanda was talking about it. He grabbed her and nuzzled her neck. Just the two of us. Ew. Wanda wasn't buying it. Neither did she approve of this idea that if they go to a nice hotel and plop the kids by the pool so they could have an alone... Oh my god, I'm really bad at reading this today. Neither did she approve of his idea that they go to a nice hotel and plop the kids by the pool so they could have time alone together. He finally pulled out all of the stops and suggested a high-priced resort that promised to entertain the kids while the parents lounged under big umbrellas on white sandy beaches. Bob wanted to relax. Wanda wanted something else. So here he was, on his way to Camp Etenia. Bob glanced in his rearview mirror to find out why it was suddenly so noisy in the minivan. Now all three of his kids were engaged in some elaborate hand-clapping game. Oh no. Wanda leaned toward Bob. Zoe? Is that Zoe? Okay, Zoe and I used to love camp when we were little girls, she told them for the 10th time. The only downside was that he had to be away from Mama and Daddy. Isn't it awesome we don't have to put the kids through that? We'll be all together for a full week. Awesome. If Wanda noticed his sarcasm, she ignored it. A deer ran across the road in front of the minivan and Bob hit the brakes. Thankfully, the minivan hadn't been going very fast. It couldn't. It had no pick-me-up for steep grades, especially at high altitudes. Even though he easily missed the deer, Bob felt his blood pressure go up. "Can you keep it down?" Bob bellowed at his kids. "I'm trying to drive up here." Momentary silence. "Do you think there are any fairies in there, Daddy?" Cindy asked him. She was staring out the side window at the dense forest crowding at the side of the road. "Why not?" Bob said. Wanda had told him over and over that Cindy was extra sensitive. He could never burst her bubble. If she wanted to believe there were fairies, it was his job to go along with it. Wanda changed the subject. "So what are we going to do when we get there?" she asked the kids. Bob groaned. Not this again. All three of them started shouting at once. "Big bubbles, talent show, karaoke, scavenger hunt, puppets, paint rocks, trampoline, dancing, hula hooping, gymnastics." Cindy called out. "Trampoline, archery, horseback riding, canoeing." I'm taking so much time going through this. "Tubing, mountain biking, hiking," Aaron shouted. "Agility, kayaking, diving, sailing, swimming, tug of war, running, ping pong, volleyball, bungee jumping, zip lining," Tyler yelled. Wanda laughed delightedly. She did this on purpose to spin up the kids. Bob was tempted to cover his ears with both hands, but obviously he couldn't do that and drive. And what about fishing, he thought. Bob loved to fish. Wanda hated it, but Wanda could manipulate with the best of them when she needed to. She'd used Bob's love of fishing against him when she was talking him into this trip. When it became clear Bob was going to Camp Etenia whenever he liked it or not, Bob had comforted himself with the idea that he could wander off and fish on his own. He could wander off? That's when the truth came out. You won't get to just go off by yourself, Wanda admitted. They have fishing tournaments, and maybe you can talk the boys into entering one with you. Why did everything have to be so organised? The kids kept firing out activities. Bob figured they'd have to stay for about 5 years to do everything the kids wanted to do. And they were only staying for a week. Only. Yeah, right. 7 days was an eternity. 7 days of fun and frolic, Wanda kept saying to him while she was getting everyone ready for the trip. She made it sound like it was supposed to be a good thing. How is Bob going to survive it? Okay, I see where this is going. I believe in the description it said that Bob was going to go against his family or something. But this seems very interesting. Camp Etenia, Bob had to admit, was a great looking place. Or it would have been if it wasn't infested with noisy families. Oh no, that is the worst. Nestled in a narrow valley between two tall, wooded mountain ranges topped with craggy rock, Camp Etenia hugged the edges of a massive, meandering, deep blue freshwater lake. Lake Amadai. Lake Amadai. Is it just me today, or is it these actual words being hard to say? Lake Amadai. I'm going to say Lake Amadai. According to the camp brochure, Amity was Cherokee for forest water. That would have been an appropriate name for a lake in the woods, except for the fact that the camp was nowhere near Cherokee territory. Why is so many of these words hard to say? When Bob pointed out that to Wanda, she didn't seem to care. Accessed via a 10-mile dirt and gravel road that left the highway at the bottom of a steep grade, Camp Etenia didn't announce itself until you were almost upon it. Then an understated rustic sign, nearly hidden behind a maple tree, reassured tired travellers they were in the right place. Camp Etenia just ahead. The camp itself was as picturesque as its surroundings. The main lodge was a huge log cabin, flanked by 2 stone chimneys and an ample porch that ran along the front and sides of the building. The structure was covered with a shiny green metal roof. The camp's 35 cabins looked like the lodge's children. Little log and stone buildings were scattered near the main lodge, like baby ducks swimming around their mum. Bob and his family were slated to be in the cabin 17. Cabin Nutter. Nutter, apparently, was an Algonquin name meaning strong. Don't care anymore. I'll say it however I want to say it. Bob's boys thought that Nutter was a hilarious name. We're going to stay in a nut house, Tyler had told all his friends when they got on their assignment. Don't mess with my Nutter, Aaron kept saying. Will it have lots of peanuts in it, Daddy? Cindy had asked several times. Wanda said, we'll get nutty. Bob responded, I'm going nuts. Oh my god, I hate this family so much already. I'm on Bob's side. He thought the name was idiotic because, again, the tribe lived nowhere near here either. The owners of Camp Etenia seemed to have reached into a swirling vortex of Native American names and randomly picked a few. Camp Etenia's parking lot was a shady, tree-guarded gravel rectangle behind the main lodge. Ooh, okay. When Bob pulled the minivan into the lot, he was reminded that you couldn't drive your car to the cabin. That would ruin the ambience, Wanda said when Bob complained about it. Is excruciating back pain from lugging all of our crap also part of the ambience? Bob said. Wanda smiled at him and applied fresh lip gloss. Well, I guess that answers that question, Bob thought. Now that he stood here next to a minivan crammed with luggage and toys, not to mention a cargo carrier stuffed with more of the same, Bob's back started throbbing just at the idea of getting everything to the cabin. And of course, Cabin Nutter was the furthest one from the parking lot. It's right at the edge of the woods, Bob. Wanda had gushed from when the cabin was assigned to them. Oh, joy and bliss, Bob said. And here they were. One woman's heaven was another man's hell. Bob looked up at the traitorous sky, which had traded its clouds for vast expanses of pale blue. The sun was almost directly overhead, and it shined down with oh my god. Why can't I say that word? Ferocity. Yeah, it shined down. Why can't I say? I swear I can say that word. I don't know. Ferocity. No, I don't know. I think it's just me today. I'm not very good today at this. Bob figured it was at least 80 degrees and the air felt heavy and muggy. Their feet crunching over the gravel, Wanda and the kids were practically dancing around the car. Cindy was spinning in circles, Aaron was doing some kind of dance, and Tyler was drumming on the minivan's hood. Wanda was calling out, "Hi," and "How are you?" to everyone within earshot. "Look, Utterflea," Cindy squealed. What is it, Pokemon? Bob followed the direction of Cindy's plump, pointed finger and saw a monarch butterfly disappear into the clump of salmonberry bushes. He flashed back to his childhood, remembering when his dad took him camping and they picked salmonberries to go with their fried fresh trout dinner. "Come on, Dad," Aaron said. "We have to get signed up or we'll miss out on all the good stuff." "Bob, why don't you go take care of all that?" Wanda handed Bob 4 sheets of paper covered with lists. He knew the list were the activities each child had chosen and the ones Wanda had decided they'd do as a family. He sighed. It's going to take all afternoon to do this. The kids and I will go scope things out and start meeting people, Wanda said. When you're done with the sign-up, you can bring stuff to the cabin. Oh, I can? Goody, Bob muttered. What's that, honey? Nothing. Bob watched his family scamper off, but he didn't move. He wished he could just go get in the car and drive away. He looked at the driver's seat. What would happen if he did that? The sweet scents of wild flowers, warred with pungent exhaust smells, but overpowering both, the powerful aromas of juniper and pine commanded attention. They made Bob think of gin and tonic, his favourite drink. I hate gin so much. It tastes like an evergreen tree. That's because tonic is... yeah, anyway. Wanda had said the first time he made her one. After that, she started calling gin and tonic that tree drink, and eventually she shortened it to a tree. Make me a tree, Wanda would say occasionally after the kids were asleep on Friday nights. He could use a tree about now. Suddenly he got shoved from behind. A kid yelled, "Sorry," as Bob staggered into the side of his minivan. Clutching the open second row door, he noticed an overweight, sweating, middle-aged man wrestle with multiple duffel bags and suitcases. The man met Bob's eye, and Bob gave him a sympathetic smile. Then Bob shut the minivan's doors and looked around. He was immediately sorry that he did. Taking in the camp from behind the driver's seat and watching his family spill from the minivan with uncontained enthusiasm had been bad enough. Seeing the whole of his purgatory in one wide angle was practically unbearable. Kids ran all over, like they'd be giving a drug that rendered them senseless, but kept them in perpetual motion. Men were morphing into pack mules. Sweating dads staggered around under the weight of their burdens. Mums were socializing and organizing. In the midst of the chaos, camp counselors blew whistles and shouted incomprehensible instructions. Bob tried to decipher what they were saying, but he couldn't. Stealing himself, he approached a ponytailed, blonde, blue-eyed counselor. She blew her whistle when he was just 4 feet away from her. The high-pitched screech catapulted into his ears and zigzagged around his brain for several seconds before he could speak. "Excuse me," he said, "but which way to sign up for activities?" Ridiculously, she blew the whistle again, but this time it was at least a short burst, and she pointed to a shallow flight of stairs on one end of the lodge. "Go up those stairs and follow the walkway to the front porch. Get in the line and it will lead you to the sign-up tables inside." She blew the whistle again. Bob's fingers itched to pull the whistle off her neck, but he contained himself. "Thanks," he said through a murderous smile. Bob went up the stairs and found the line on the lodge's front porch. From here he could see that his family was already settling in. Cindy was holding hands with another girl, this one with black braids and spinning around on a big dock that stretched over the lake. What was it with little kids and spinning? Near Cindy, Wanda was talking to a woman whilst Bob's boys and another boy took turns trying to skip rocks across the surface of the lake. And here he was, standing in line so he could take care of paperwork. Story of his life. Bob lost track of how long he waited. Files droned around his head, and he felt his nose starting to burn. That would teach him to ignore Wanda's advice to put on sunscreen. "It's going to rain," he told her confidently. "You never know," she said. It was amazing how often she did know what he didn't know. Someplace nearby, someone played a guitar. Someplace even nearer, someone ate beef jerky. Bob wrinkled his nose. The smell made his stomach roil. Other parents were chatting in line, but Bob kept his head down. For the first time since he'd pulled the minivan out of his driveway, he was able to think about the proposal he wished he was home working on. He didn't have time to take a week's vacation, and if he did, he sure didn't want to take it running himself, ragged doing activities with a bunch of strangers. Honestly, he needed to be alone. Bob turned to watch his family again. Cindy and her new friend were now playing a makeshift game of hopscotch between the lawn and the lake, while the boys were trying to balance on the pilings along the edge of the dock. He was sure he was going to hear a splash pretty soon. Bob finally reached the doorway of the lodge. Hard to believe, but it would eventually be his turn. Curious in spite of himself, he looked around the lodge's interior. It was just as the brochure depicted. Exposed log walls, Lots of big heavy wood furniture padded with cushions covered in vaguely Native American patterns. A massive buck's head presided over the fireplace, and the chandeliers hanging from the log roof were made of antlers. This was not the best place to be a deer. Bob took one last peek at his family before he stepped completely into the building. As expected, the boys fell into the lake. Cindy continued to play hopscotch. Wanda laughed at her sons, only because they were laughing too. If anyone had asked Bob if he loved his family, he would have answered a vehement yes, because he did. But that didn't mean he liked them all the time. Relatable. And lately, he'd been liking them less and less. They always wanted something. "Daddy, look at the picture I drew," Cindy would say. "Daddy, can you throw the ball to me?" Aaron would ask. "Dad, can you please help me with my school project?" Tyler would beg. "Honey, the garage door is rattling. Please fix that," Wanda would order. Yeah, order. She always said please, but it felt no less like an order than it did when the boss said, "Get that done today, please." Bob was tired of all the requests, all the obligations. He needed to breathe. "It's your turn, dude." Someone tapped Bob on the shoulder. He looked around. A young dad who obviously still loved fatherhood stood behind Bob. The dad grinned and pointed over Bob's shoulder. "You're up." At the table in front of Bob, a hefty, tanned woman with super short, dirty blonde hair and smile lines around her eyes looked up at him. "Hi, I'm Marjorie." She gave him a big smile, and he admired her very white, even teeth, while he pointed to the white plastic name pinned to her green Camp Atenia shirt. "Welcome to Camp Atenia." "Oh, is that where I am?" He was aiming for dry humour, but apparently he missed the mark. Marjorie's smile faltered. She frowned for a second and then said, "Name, Mackenzie." The woman tapped the keys on a wireless laptop. "Bob, Wanda, Cindy, Aaron and Tyler. That's right. Okay, let's get you signed up. Have you prepared your list of activities?" Bob handed the woman Wanda's neat lists. The camp offered 112 activities and asked that campers come prepared with lists of at least 20, ordered by preference. Wanda's lists held 72 activities altogether. Bob wondered what Marjorie would do with that. But she didn't seem surprised at all. "Perfect," Marjorie said as she began typing. Bob watched her, his jaw clenched. One of the objections he had to Campatania, in fact to any summer camp, was the rigidity of the whole thing. He had no issues with being outdoors or doing fun things, but doing things on a schedule, following a list, that drove him nuts. Maybe he did belong in Cabin Nutter. Seriously though, didn't he get enough schedules and lists to follow at work? At least at work he was getting paid. Why did he have to be subjected to do this crap at home too? Marjorie stopped typing. "I wasn't able to get you every activity listed, but I managed the top 20 for each of your children and for your family as a whole. Awesome juice." Bob enjoyed using one of Tyler's favourite sayings. Tyler actually meant it when he said it. But for Bob, awesome juice meant either "that sucks" or "I couldn't care less." Marjorie handed Bob's list back to him, then looked both ways and behind her before leaning forward. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Bob heard, "Do you want?" but the rest was incomprehensible. "Oh." He leaned forward. "I'm sorry." He leaned forward. "I'm sorry." Marjorie leaned forward too. Her breath smelled like chocolate. Ew. "Do you want to sign up for a bunny call?" "Oh," she asked. "That's so suspicious." He must have misheard her. Bob asked, "What's that?" Marjorie turned and pointed toward a tall rabbit standing in the far corner of the massive room, under an antique canoe hanging from the vaulted ceiling. The rabbit, which had bright orange fur, wore a white and black-chested vest, a yellow and white polka dot bow tie, and a black top hat, through which its floppy ears stuck straight up. The rabbit held symbols, like old-fashioned wind-up monkeys used to have, like the one from Toy Story 3. Bob blinked. How had he missed the rabbit when he first looked around? It was like missing an anaconda in a pen full of puppies. The rabbit did not belong. It really did not belong. Bob was mesmerised by the rabbit for several seconds. He couldn't tell if the rabbit was a person wearing a costume or one of those creepy animatronic things he'd seen in a couple of restaurants his family had visited in when he was young. Probably that. In any case, it wasn't the kind of rabbit that made you want to cuddle up to it. Its eyes were a little too big to be friendly. They bordered on a crazed. "Mr. Mackenzie? Bob?" Bob blinked. "Huh?" Marjorie grinned at him and winked. "When you sign up for a bunny called the rabbit over there, his name is Ralpho, will visit your cabin." Bob looked back at the rabbit. "Ralpho. He'll come into your cabin screaming, clashing cymbals and spinning on its head." Oh god. Oh god, this is actually going to be scary. Marjorie chuckled. "It's really something terrifying to behold." Bob could just imagine it. "It's quite the wake-up call." Marjorie added. Bob didn't get it. Wake-up call? Oh right, I didn't say. Ralpho makes his rounds between 5 AM and 6 AM. During that hour, he'll visit every cabin that signs up for a bunny call. It's a bit of a naughty prank we play on the children on their first day here. Most of them love to have that rush of terror when they're scared silly first thing in the morning. Oh no, he's going to scare his children! No! Marjorie chuckled again. In her low voice, the sound was reminiscent of a villain's devilish laugh. "Are you interested?" Bob looked from Marjorie to Ralpho and back again. He thought about his annoyingly happy family and their insistence that he spend his only week off this summer in his poorly disguised detention centre for overworked dads. He thought about how long he'd stood in this stupid line signing up for all the Assanin activities. He thought about all the luggage he still had to schlep to Cabin Nutter. Then he thought about how his family reacted to loud noises in the morning. That thought began teasing some of his good humour to the surface. "Sure," he grinned. "This is going to be a riot." "Wonderful," Marjorie said. She tapped her keyboard again. "There, all signed up." She smiled at him, and he smiled back. It was Bob's first genuine smile of the day. It was the first moment since this trip had been scheduled that he felt something other than resentment and annoyance. He even felt a little delighted. Marjorie leaned over to grab a stack of papers she'd just printed. She thrust them in front of Bob. "If you could read these over to be sure you approve, and then initial each page." She handed him a pen. He sighed and read the excruciating list one more time. He didn't prove at all, but he initialed the pages anyway. Marjorie beamed. "Excellent!" She shuffled the papers and stapled some of them together. "Here are your schedules," she said. "Ralpho will visit in the morning, and the rest of your activities are blocked out on the calendar." She handed Bob a key and a little booklet. "Key to Cabin Nutter and a book of camp rules," she explained. "Oh lovely, a book of rules." Bob needed more rules, like he needed a few more jobs or a few more kids. He didn't say that out loud, he just took the rule book and the key. "Have fun and don't hesitate to ask if you need anything," Marjorie said. Bob nodded at her, gave Ralpho one last look, and then headed outside. He noticed his step felt lighter. He was tempted to do a little spin as he headed out the door. Instead, he turned to Ralpho one last time and tipped an imaginary hat to his new friend. "Thanks, buddy," Bob said quietly. Ralpho had given Bob the most profound sense of gratification he'd had in weeks. Oh, okay. Bob pulled the last load of luggage into Cabin Nutter and stepped back outside to catch his breath. Basically an A-frame with a shallow porch, Cabin Nutter was a simple log structure with two small side windows, one picture window in the front, and a small window on the loft level. Bob shook his head at the cabin. It wasn't the 5-star hotel he had envisioned spending his vacation in. "Bob?" Wanda called. He went inside the cabin, and Wanda gave him what he'd come to think of as the look. The look was a lips quirked to the side with an eyebrow raised expression that meant, "You're not doing what I want you to do." "What?" Bob asked. "You need to get a move on. It's time for the opening day picnic," Wanda complained, bustling over to Bob and waving the schedule under his nose. "See? 4 PM. We're going to be late." "No one is on time for the picnics," Bob said. Wanda threw a pair of khaki shorts and navy blue polo shirt in his direction. "Here, change into these. You smell like sweat. You think?" Wanda's words had sounded accusatory, and he wanted to ask her how he was supposed to have gotten all their stuff to the cabin without working up a little sweat. Instead, he watched Wanda set up Cindy's sleeping kit, a small vinyl pouch tucked into a white wicker basket. The pouch held the sleep mask and earplugs, and the basket included a cup of water with a lid. From early in their relationship, Bob had known that Wanda was a loud snorer. She'd fallen asleep on his shoulder at an outdoor concert once, and her snores were somehow audible over the loud music. When they had kids, he found out the snoring thing was genetic, and unfortunately it came with a propensity toward light sleep and an overreaction to being awakened by loud noises or bright light. I swear Scott has gotten better at writing. These days, Wanda and the kids all wore earplugs and blackout sleep masks to bed. Bob never bothered with a mask, but Wanda's snores forced him to wear earplugs, and even those weren't enough to keep him from feeling like he spent every night in a working sawmill. That was another thing about his trip that displeased him. All 4 of his snoring family members in one small area. Bob didn't see a lot of sleep coming his way over the next 7 days. One of the reasons he got such a kick out of the bunny call was he thought it would mete out a bit of justice. I don't know. I've never seen that word before. If he had to be tortured all night, at least they'd get a little shock in the morning. True. Cabin Nutter was as basic on the inside as it was on the outside. On the first floor, the cabin held a double daybed with a pull-out trundle bed beneath, a table with 5 chairs, a chest of drawers, and a small refrigerator. A door led to a tiny bathroom. Up in the loft, the 2 twin beds with matching nightstands were tucked under the roof's steep pitch. The cabin had no shelves or closets. Instead, coat hooks lined several of the walls, and low benches were set under the hooks, presumably to hold luggage. Wanda had already stashed all of their suitcases neatly in rows. She'd also piled snacks, paper plates and cups, and a roll of paper towels on top of the refrigerator. "I thought there would be bunk beds," Aaron had said when Bob reached the cabin. "Bunk beds would have been fun." When I was your cage? Oh my gosh, I really am bad at reading. "When I was your age, your uncle and I were complaining that we had to have bunk beds," Bob told his son. "We thought twin beds would have been fun." "Yeah," Aaron said, "but you're old." Bob wondered what that had to do with it. He didn't think himself as old, although with each passing day the label got closer to sticking. But even if he was old, did old automatically mean wrong? He was thinking to think it did. Bob surveyed the cabin's beds, indulging in a moment's anticipation for the bunny call. Every bed in the cabin was covered with a red blanket, and the sheets were dark green. This gave the place a decidedly Christmassy feel that was heightened by the green and red striped curtains on the windows. Bob thought it was a little weird, and had said so when he first entered the cabin, but Wanda had insisted, "It's festive." "Exactly my point," Bob had said. Although the boys didn't like the lack of bunk beds, they did like one of the cabin's features. It had a trapdoor in the floor. Oh god. "What's that for?" Aaron? Oh my god, Aaron asked when he found it. Bob made Aaron wait while he dropped through the trapdoor and checked what was below. Turned out it was just the cabin's crawl space. Bob figured they decided to put the crawl space door inside to prevent critters from getting under the cabins, or maybe it was an insulation thing. Whatever it was, it delighted the boys, who went in and out through the crawl space several times, jabbering about hidden treasure. Wanda snapped her fingers in front of Bob's face. "Why are you just standing there?" She gave him a push. "Change!" Obediently, Bob began peeling off his sweaty clothes, replacing them with fresh ones. When he was done changing, he stood at mock attention in front of his wife, who had already changed into a simple emerald green sundress. "Do I pass muster?" Wanda smiled, gave him a hug and kissed him on the cheek. She recoiled. "Oh, Ruff, you need a shave." "I'm on vacation," Bob reminded her. "That's an excuse to give your wife whisker burn?" Bob sighed. Would he ever get a break from anything? He picked up his shaving kit. "Not now," Wanda said. "We're late." Bob dropped the kit in frustration. "Well then, you just tell me exactly when and where and how, and I'll do exactly what you want," he said. Wanda didn't seem to hear the acrimony in his words. She probably thought he was serious because she smiled at him and linked her arm through his. "Let's go to a picnic." Spread out over a vast expanse of lawns sloping down to a sandy beach, the picnic was a chaotic mass of food, games and socializing. Bob wanted to run and hide in the forest the second he and his family reached the edges of the tumulus. What? What is that? Why are there so many big random words I don't know? Camp Etenia welcomes you. A bright green banner shouted from its place stretched between two massive fir trees. Bob doubted that Camp Etenia welcomed any of them. It was more probable that the camp wanted them to all go away. In fact, Bob was pretty sure Lake Armadi wished the camp that had never been built. Bob had entered the architecture firm as an apprentice right out of school, and in the 12 years he worked there, he'd learnt a lot about form and function and energy and landscape. Walking sites to prepare plans, he often had a sense of when a place welcomed a structure and when it didn't. Not that he ever shared the tidbit with anyone. He kept his intuitive sense of a place in mind when he designed structures, but he never told his clients he was repositioning a building on a site because the earth wanted it that way. He had some sort of weird sense about land and nature, but he wasn't stupid. "Come on, Bob," Wanda tugged on his arm. "Stop loitering. You look like a deer in headlights." "I feel like a deer in headlights." That was a weird laugh. "I'll probably be mounted on one of the lodge walls by the end of the week." "Very funny," Wanda towed Bob to the end of a row of picnic tables. They were lined up, covered with dark green vinyl cloths and valiantly trying to hold several tons of food. Wanda handed him a heavy-duty paper plate. "We might as well eat while the kids play. Then I'll coral them and help them with their own meals." Bob looked around for the kids. The boys appeared to have become ninja warriors. They wore green headbands now, and they were having sword fights with long sticks. He glanced toward a clutter of toddlers clambering down a clown who was smearing paint on a red-headed girl's face. Cindy was hopping up and down next to the girl. "Me too, me too!" She squealed loudly enough so Bob could hear her clearly from a great distance. "Make me buzzy honeybee," Cindy commanded. Bob winced and turned back to the food. He hated clowns. "Doesn't it smell good?" Wanda gestured at the platters of potato salad, bean salad, macaroni salad, pasta salad, green salad, deviled eggs, raw veggies, and dip, chips and dip, baked beans, and various casseroles that were covering the picnic tables. "Honestly, all I can smell is burnt hot dogs," Bob said. A barbecue was set up halfway between the food tables and the lodge. From the charred smells and flames belching into the air far too high for safety, Bob wasn't sure the chef, a skinny camp employee with a narrow, flushed face, knew what he was doing. Wanda wrinkled her nose. "The hot dogs are why I encouraged Cindy to get her face painted. But really, can't you smell the dill in this salad? And the thyme in this one? Give them a chance." "Woof," Bob said before dutifully sniffing the salads. What? He couldn't smell anything except overcooked barbecue. Wanda giggled. "Come on, you're holding up the line." Bob sighed and started dishing up the salads. While he piled food on his plate, he tried not to dread the inevitable scene that would unfold when Cindy realized there were hot dogs being consumed all around her. Cindy thought hot dogs were cruel. "I can't eat doggies," Cindy had protested the first time hot dogs were presented to her. No manner of explanation convinced her that the term hot dog was not precisely descriptive of what she was eating. "Bob," Wanda gave him a gentle shove. "Honey, whatever you're thinking about, you can think about later. Come on." Wanda led him to a long picnic table filled with laughing couples. "Are these seats taken?" Wanda asked one of the couples. "Nope, they're all yours." A large boisterous woman with big hair and a mouth to match sang out. "Pull up a bench." She laughed as if she had said the funniest thing in the world. Her laugh was a high-pitched trill that sounded like a bird's mating call. Her husband, a small, sandy-haired man with sunburnt ears, glanced up and offered an unconvincing replica of a smile. Bob matched it with his own social tooth-baring. Wanda plopped down on the bench and scooted in to make room for Bob. "I'm Darlene," the large woman said, "and this is Frank." Yes. She pointed at the guy with the sunburnt ears. Frank lifted a fork, then returned to eating. "Don't mind him," Darlene said. "When he gets food in front of him, he forgets how to talk. Eats like a horse, my Frank. And look at him. It's not fair. I eat a carrot and I gain a pound." Bob had no idea what to say to that, so he let Wanda handle it. He heard her say something sympathetic while he put his attention to his food. The bench was hard and narrow, and it hurt his butt. He shifted, and he whacked his knee on the picnic table frame. He shifted again, and a splinter the size of a small knife jabbed him in the thigh. A pair of flies dive-bombed his plate, and he shooed them away. This was supposed to be fun. Oh, this is supposed to be fun? Sorry, my intonation isn't great today. He stabbed a chunk of potato and stuffed it in his mouth. It wasn't cooked all the way through. He hated crunchy potatoes and potato salad. He made a face as he chewed, wishing he could spit it out. Wishing he could spit out this whole miserable experience. While Bob ate, an animated conversation about camp activities began. Everyone at the table offered an opinion about what was going to be the most fun thing to do at Camp Britannia. Even Frank, who had finished eating, joined in with apparent glee when he talked about the tennis tournament that would start the next day. When Wanda piped up to tell everyone that their whole family was competing in a capture the flag tournament next day, Bob almost groaned out loud. He'd forgotten he'd agreed to do that. The very thought of running around the woods trying to grab a piece of cloth made his teeth hurt. Bob had hoped that after the picnic he could spend the rest of the day sitting in a deck chair, but he was reminded why he rarely bothered being optimistic. The picnic ended at 6, and Wanda informed him that the family was signed up for team competitions from 6 to 9, in darts, horseshoes, and the card game Hand and Foot. After that, there would be a big campfire and a marshmallow roast. "It's going to be great fun," Wanda chirped a little later as she cleaned up the ketchup smeared on Cindy's face. Predictably, Bob's family finished last in darts and horseshoes, and 7th in the Hand and Foot tournament, but Tyler was the only one who had a problem with that. Luckily, his disappointment didn't last long. Tyler was like his mum. He didn't dwell on what he couldn't change. He just moved on to the next possibility around the corner. "That's what life is all about, Bob," Wanda always told him. "Possibility. Every day is filled with possibility. You just have to look for it." Bob had thought this was adorable for the first few years he was with Wanda. Now it was grating on him, maybe because he wasn't seeing a lot of possibilities that pleased him. This one, for instance, wasn't high on his good times list. The evening's campfire was a massive conflagration expelling smoke that hung in choking swirls over the entire lawn and bench. Bob's eyes burned, and his throat fell raw. "Look at the big fire, Daddy," Cindy said, tugging on his hand so they could move closer. Bob had instinctively grabbed Cindy's hand as soon as he'd seen the fire. She loved bright things, and he knew she'd make a beeline for it, which she did. "Fire's hot, sweetie," he said. "We'll look at it from over here." He tried leading her to a pair of lawn chairs well away from the flames, but she was having none of it. "No! Fire! Roost schmellows!" "What? What is going on in this book?" Cindy demanded. Wanda took Cindy's other hand. "I'll take her. You go sit." Bob let go of Cindy's hand. "Thanks." Wanda blew him a kiss and trotted with Cindy toward the marshmallows and crackling fire. Bob turned toward the lawn chairs, but of course they were all taken now. He scanned the area for a place to sit. Sighing, he went toward one of the logs set up around the campfire and awkwardly perched on the curved edge. A mosquito immediately appeared and landed on his knee. He smacked his knee and killed the mosquito. "I thought you guys didn't like smoke," he said to the dead bug. "I think they get used to it," a balding man with a big gut said as he dropped onto the log next to Bob. "Maybe they build up a tolerance in places like this." His voice was deep and smooth. He could have been a radio personality. "Think so?" Bob said non-committally. Yeah. He held out his hand. "Bob Mackenzie. Stephen Bell." The man shook Bob's hand. "Actually," he said, "I think my theory's full of it. Mosquitoes don't live long enough to build up a tolerance. Did you know that the average female mosquito lives about 50 days and the average male lives about 10 days? "Figures," Bob said. "The females and the babies never leave them alone." Stephen laughed. "You got that right." He gestured toward a pair of very pretty blonde girls Bob guessed were 13 or 14. The girls were flirting with a couple teen boys wearing pants so baggy they were about to fall off. Or they worry themselves to death. "Those two girls are mine." The guy shook his head. "I don't sleep much." Bob nodded. "I can see why. You have girls?" "One. She's just 3. 2 boys too. Fatherhood's not for the faint of heart," Stephen said. "But it's a heck of a lot of fun." Bob offered a socially acceptable nod that didn't represent at all what he was thinking. It was nearly 11 p.m. by the time this whole family was back in the cabin and the kids were ready for bed. The boys said good night and fell into their twin beds, asleep almost the second they hit the mattresses. Their snores began vibrating the exposed ceiling beams immediately. Cindy, on the other hand, was wound up. Wearing one of the cabin's extra quilts as a cape, she was dancing around the place shouting, "I'm a princess!" "If you're a princess, where's your crown?" Bob asked. "Oh, now you've done it, Bob," Wanda said. And sure enough, Cindy started crying because she didn't have a crown. "Oops," Bob said. Just oops. It took Wanda several minutes to convince Cindy that they can make her a princess crown during crafting time the next day. In the meantime, Cindy had an invisible crown. "Okay," Cindy finally said. Wanda and Bob sighed in relief. Cindy still wasn't ready to go to sleep. "Story!" she begged, crawling into Bob's lap. Bob sat with his back against the metal frame of the double daybed. He was pretty sure the frame, in the previous life, had been a medieval torture device. It managed to attack both his spine and his kidneys at the same time. Bob wrapped his arms around Cindy and tried not to inhale her smoky scent. Normally Cindy smelled like strawberries and vanilla at night. The strawberry scent was from her shampoo and the vanilla was from the warm vanilla almond milk she liked to drink before bed. Wanda decided to skip the kids' bath time tonight because the day had been so long, and Cindy was already feeling bloopy from too many schmallows to make room for her usual before-bed treat. Bob watched Wanda open the window on the far side of the cabin. She was fanatical about having fresh air in the evening, no matter how cold it was outside. At least it wasn't that frigid tonight. Wanda crossed the cabin, pulled back the covers, and slid in next to Bob. She looked at her daughter. "Okay, what story are we doing tonight?" she asked Cindy. This was the routine. Bob held his daughter and Wanda told the story. Bob could design and even build houses, but he couldn't put together a story to save his life. Wanda was a storyteller. "Caterpillar!" Cindy shrieked pretty much right into Bob's ear. Cindy is the life of this story. I should say that. He cringed but didn't push her away. "Okay." Wanda leaned over and kissed the top of Cindy's head. She sneezed, then nestled close to Bob, laying her head on his shoulder. From there, she began to tell a convoluted story about a caterpillar who built his cocoon all wrong and had to redo it so he could become a butterfly. At one point, Bob was tempted to insert a couple architectural details regarding the building process, but he wisely remained silent. Good on you. Good on you. At the beginning of Wanda's story, Cindy kept piping up with her opinion about how things should go. Every time she did, she squirmed and ended up elbowing Bob in some sensitive area of his anatomy. Some sensitive area of his anatomy, okay. It was like trying to cuddle with a small kangaroo. Bob wasn't a huge fan of the experience, but about 5 minutes in, she closed her eyes and her body went limp. This was the part of the night Bob did like. In fact, he pretty much loved it. When Cindy relaxed, her sweet toddler Pudge filled Bob's arms with pillowy, warm softness, and then holding her was one of the most sweet and comforting things in the world. Sometimes it was so comforting he forgot who he was and what he had to do the next day. He forgot to be overwhelmed and angry and resentful. It took him back to his childhood, to memories of snuggling his well-worn teddy bear. "Earplugs," Wanda whispered, holding them out. Bob took the earplugs and gently inserted them into Cindy's ears while Wanda took care of her own. She gave Bob a kiss on the cheek, put on her sleep mask and said "good night" as she held onto her side next to him. Wanda and Cindy started to snore almost simultaneously. Cindy's first whirring blat landed in the same ear she'd shrieked into a few minutes before. This time Bob shifted Cindy in his arms, but he didn't immediately transfer her to the trundle bed. He just sat there, holding his daughter and listening to his family's rumbling snores. Beyond the snores, the noises of the nighttime forest reached out to Bob's senses. That, combined with the tender sweetness of his family snuggling close, eased the remaining tension in his body. Nighttime in the forest was actually one of the things he'd been okay with about his trip. He remembered lying in his sleeping bag next to his dad, under the stars, listening to the crickets. Ever since then, nature's night sounds had soothed him. Bob tried to hear the crickets now, but all he could hear was Cindy's little popping splurt floops in his ear. That was okay too. Wait, was that an owl? Bob listened hard. Yes, an owl hooted not too far from the cabin. Bob's dad, a nature and animal lover, was interested in animal symbolism. He taught Bob that owls were often seen as harbingers of death, but they could also be portents of renewal and rebirth. What message did this owl have for Bob? Bob didn't know, but he did know that for these cherished moments holding Cindy, he could convince himself that he had good things in his life. He could talk himself into the all is well mentality Wanda lived out every day. Suddenly Bob stiffened. The image of an orange bunny with a white and black checked vest flitted into his mind. Ralpho! Oh man, Bob whispered. How could he have signed up for his family for such a cruel prank? It was probably going to traumatize Cindy for life. Listening to the snoring concert going on around him, Bob thought about how upset his wife and kids always were when they were awakened abruptly. Doing that on purpose wasn't the nicest thing in the world. No. Tell the truth, Bob, he berated himself. The truth was that signing up his family for the bunny crew. I don't know how to say that word because it's a fake word. What had he been thinking? He'd been thinking about himself. Now he thought about his peacefully sleeping wife and kids. However put upon he might feel on his trip, taking it out on them wasn't justice at all. It was selfish and childish. He sighed. Well, it was too late now. Hopefully the bunny call wouldn't be so bad. Bob inched away from his wife and carefully placed Cindy in the trundle bed. Then he put in his own earplugs and lay back on his pillow. In spite of his exhaustion, he lay there a long time before he fell asleep. Bob sat up in bed and clawed at his earplugs. Digging them frantically from his ears, he felt like his heart hammer against his ribcage like it was desperate to get out. Sweat glued his grey t-shirt and boxer shorts to his body. What in the world? Usually Bob didn't sleep all that well, but he wasn't prone to panic attacks or night sweats. So what woke him up? He looked around the cabin. Was everything okay? It seemed to be. His wife and kids were snoring in a strangely endearing harmony of buzzing and honking tones. The doors were closed, but through the open window he could still hear the peaceful sounds to which he'd fallen asleep. Nothing appeared to be amiss. Bob tried to calm his breathing, but it wouldn't slow down. He concentrated to try and remember what he'd been dreaming before Ralpho. That was what he was dreaming about. He'd been dreaming about Ralpho. Obviously his guilt had followed him into his sleep. Bob took a deep breath and got out of bed. He grabbed the pen light on his keyring. Bob used his pen light to find safe passage past the end of the trundle bed and then a few feet across the floor to the bathroom. There, he closed the door and turned on the light over the sink. He looked at himself in the mirror. Still the same Bob. Or was he? This Bob looked a little feral. His eyes were bloodshot and his hair stuck out. His mouth was stretched into a wide grimace. This Bob looked like he'd made a deal with the devil. Had he? Oh. Bob snorted and shook his head. He noticed his eyebrows were getting too bushy. In the last year or so, Bob had started losing hair on the top of his head, and he'd started growing hair where he didn't want any extra. How was that fair? Oh, forget fair. What purpose did it serve? Leaning over the sink, Bob ran cool water and splashed his face. While his family continued to snore, he thought about Ralpho again. He looked at his watch. It was 11:50 p.m. He'd barely slept before he woke up. This did not bode well for a good night's sleep. Just over 5 hours before Ralpho would show up. Could Bob call it off? If he could, how would he do it? Were the camp counselors available during the night? Yes. He remembered. The cabins had no phones, and Camp Petenia had no cell phone coverage, but an idle flip through the rulebook had revealed that every cabin was equipped with a large bell you could use to signal for help in case of an emergency. Bob didn't think that this was a bell-ringing emergency. In fact, he was pretty sure if he rang a bell to cancel the bunny call, they'd kick him out of the camp. Then again, Bob shook his head. He wasn't going to humiliate his family by ringing an emergency bell to cancel the prank, even if it might get him out of this so-called vacation. Besides, if he did that, they'd know what he'd set up. Bob leaned over the sink again and slurped some water, straightening and wiping his mouth. He decided he was making way too much out of a silly prank. Ralpho was just some kid in a rabbit suit, right? All Ralpho would do was scare the kids a little, probably annoy his wife, and that would be it. No big deal. Wasn't part of parenting getting the kids ready for the big bad world? If they could be undone by a noisy orange rabbit, how did they have any hope of surviving real world battles like those Bob faced every day? Bob nodded at himself in the mirror and turned off the bathroom light. He'd convinced himself that the bunny call would be good for his kids. Bob was doing the kids a favour, and Wanda, well, Wanda was a big girl. She could handle it. And if not, well, she did drag him to this absurd place. A little payback wouldn't be so bad, would it? Bob nodded again, and headed back to bed. Oh no. No! Bob lay on his side in the dark. How much time had passed since the last time he checked? He pressed the button on the side of his watch, and the tiny light revealed digital numbers informing him a mere 19 minutes had passed since he'd last checked. Compulsively checked the time. And before that 19 minutes, it had been 23 minutes. Before that, it had been 33 minutes. Before that, it was 37 minutes. Before that, it was 49 minutes. If he kept up this pattern, he'd be waking up every couple of minutes within the next half hour. Approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes of thrashing in bed and opening his eyes to check his watch. What a great night Bob was having. Apparently, he didn't believe all this rational arguments in favour of the bunny call. Bob closed his eyes and tried to go back to sleep. Sure enough. The next time he looked at his watch, 13 minutes had passed, then 7, and now 3. It was getting close to 3 a.m. 2 more hours. 1.5 hours. 1 hour. A half hour. 15 minutes. 5 minutes. His eyes felt like something had been trying to scrape its way out through the irises all night long. Bob looked around the cabin, but he only saw a whole lot of blackness. At home, the house was never this dark. Their home had exterior lights, and the subdivision had street lights. Camp Atenia's cabins didn't have exterior lights because, according to the camp's brochure, that would ruin the nature experience. Wanda had brought a nightlight from home, but the boys refused to let her plug it in. "It will ruin the nature experience, Mum," they'd said in unison before, laughing in uproariously. And so Cabin Nutter was nothing but a featureless void. If it wasn't for the sounds of his family's snores, Bob could have convinced himself he was alone in a vacuum. Bob held very still and listened. Was Ralpho on the move? Was he out there someplace? Was he right outside the cabin? Bob felt his arm hairs stand up and quiver in the dark. "Wuss," he whispered. He wished he could hear something other than snoring. Ralpho could be right outside the door, and Bob wouldn't know it until the door started to open. Bob fumbled for his penlight and aimed it at the cabin door. He let out his breath. Okay, good. He could see what was coming now. So, now what? Should he just wait here for Ralpho to burst in and scare his family half to death? What kind of dad did that? Bob threw back the covers and got up. Wanda snorted and turned over. Cindy made a noise that sounded like a chortle. Bob shone his light on the door again. Should he check outside? Yes, you idiot, he told himself. Standing there in the dark wasn't accomplishing anything. Bob crossed to the chest of drawers between the bed and the window on the right side of the cabin. He felt around in the top drawer for a pair of sweats. Finding them, he pulled them on. Then he went to the cabin door and slipped on the sandals that were neatly lined up on a row of smaller sandals against the wall. He opened the door, tensing because he half expected to be smacked upside the head with a cymbal. But the cabin's small porch was empty. Bob looked out at the blackness that surrounded Cabin Nutter. He glanced up at the sky. No moon, no stars. Apparently, the clouds had come back. But what good were they at night? And where was that rain? It didn't matter. He was distracting himself from the matter at hand. Resisting the urge to turn on his penlight, Bob let his eyes adapt to the dark. It didn't take long for him to be able to pick out shapes. He could see the vague outlines of the nearest 3 cabins, and he could also see the vertical pattern of the woods at the edge of the camp. Between 2 of the cabins, a handful of distorted shapes baffled Bob until he remembered a rustic playground was situated there. Bob saw a small spark of light in the playground area. He froze. Was that Ralpho? What if that was Ralpho using a penlight like Bob's? Bob strained to see in the dark. Then he realized he was looking at the glowing end of a cigarette. Good. Rabbits don't smoke. Bob contained a burst of laughter. Rabbits didn't smoke. Was Cabin Nutter really making him nuts? Ralpho wasn't a real rabbit. Bob watched the minuscule circle of light. It rose and lowered a couple of times. Then Bob realized he could just make out the outline of a man. A man, not a rabbit. Closing the cabin door behind him, Bob stepped off the cabin's porch. He headed across the 100 feet or so from his cabin to the lit cigarette. The early morning air was cool and heavy with the thickly sweet scent of the woods and the fresh scent of recently cut grass. dew moistened Bob's toes as he walked. Away from his snore-ridden cabin, Bob could hear night sounds more clearly. Crickets were industriously chirruping. Okay, what? He also heard the rustle and crack of tree branches bending to the will of the wind that had apparently started blowing during the night. As Bob neared the tiny flicker of light, he heard a man's feet shuffle against rocky ground, and then a loud sigh. "Hello there," Bob called out softly. The tiny light jerked. "Sorry to startle you, I couldn't sleep." Bob listened to the man suck in the smoke, and then expel it. The smell of menthol made Bob's nostrils twitch. "Me neither," the smoker said unnecessarily. A flashlight clicked on, and the smoker shined a beam of light onto his face. It made the smoker look sinister, especially with smoke pouring out of his nose, but Bob could tell the guy was probably pretty normal looking in the daytime. He had a thick head of light-coloured hair, and he had what might be blue eyes. The eyes, though, looked sad. Bob flicked on his penlight and shined it on his own face. He chuckled. "Not our best sides, huh?" The smoker appeared to smile. It was hard to tell. The macabre effects of his flashlight turned the smile into a sneer. "I'm Bob." Bob offered his hands. "Philip." Philip took the last drag of his cigarette and pinched it out between his two fingers before taking Bob's hand and shaking it. Bob felt a little intimidated by the pinching a lit cigarette move, but he told himself to grow up. Aiming his light around, he saw that Philip was leaning against the end of the swing set. Bob was tempted to take a seat in one of the swings, but then he'd feel even more like a little boy than he already did. "You stand up for the bunny call too?" Philip asked. Bob's breathing sputtered like a guttering candle. He had to run his tongue around inside his mouth before he answered. "Yeah." Philip flicked his lighter on and off, then stuffed it in his pocket. "Probably not my best decision." His expression... Oh God, what was that? His expression seemed a little severe for the situation, didn't it? "I've been awake most of the night thinking about it," Bob admitted. He looked at his watch. "What's the time?" Philip asked. "It's 5:08, Bob said. "Why doesn't time crawl when things are going right?" Bob didn't answer. What was the point? So he stood in the dark with Philip and listened to the wind. He also listened to the ticking of an imaginary clock. It ticked louder than any real clock Bob had ever heard. Ralpho could show up at any minute. The men listened and waited. Bob's intestines felt like battling serpents flailing around inside his belly. Bob was seconds from throwing up, but he managed to get himself under control. The serpent slid back down into his gut, but it didn't stop writhing. "My mum collected stuff," Bob said. Philip shifted at the unexpected words. His back chuffed against the swing set. Bob was surprised too. He didn't know he was going to say out loud what he was thinking about. Since he started, though, he figured he'd finish. It was better than hanging out here waiting for an orange rabbit while his anxiety ate him alive from the inside. Her favourite collectibles were baskets and china teacups. An image of Bob's mother filled his mind. His mum had been old school and very feminine. She always wore pastel slacks and floral silk blouses, even on house cleaning day. She always tried to be the perfect wife. She'd kind of spoiled Bob, if he was being honest. He'd thought he had a life like his dad's. He'd come home from work, put his feet up and read the paper. Talk about culture shock. Not that Wanda wasn't a great wife. Bob remembered he was telling a story. She kept her most prized baskets on top of the hutch in the dining room, and the teacups were on top of the sideboard that was next to the hutch. Bob paused and listened to the wind. That was the wind, wasn't it? When nothing appeared out of the night, he continued. "One day I thought it would be fun to see if I could throw my basketball up into one of her baskets. I have no idea why that seemed like a good idea. I was 9. Philip didn't say anything. The sense of urgency Bob had felt since he'd gotten out of bed suddenly multiplied tenfold. He rushed on with his story. "So I tossed the ball up into a perfect arc. I'd been practicing and it lands in the biggest basket. I'm jumping around like I've won a tournament, making all the crowd noises, whooping and cheering. But then the ball starts to tip the basket, and the basket starts to go over. It happens in super slow motion, like a millionth of an inch per few seconds. Or at least that's how it seems. And then the basket is on its side, and the ball is on its way past the other baskets and on down the side of the hutch. I can see what's going to happen, and I'm in motion immediately. But there's no way I can stop it. The ball comes down and lands on the sideboard, scattering Mum's teacups all over the place. All but one of them broke. Mum was devastated. Bob stopped and cleared his throat. Once I made the decision, the rest of it was out of my control. He shook his head. I think I made a decision like that today with the bunny call. A loud half-baying, half-yelping cry sounded in the distance. Oh no! Bob and Philip both whirled around. Was it the wind, or something else? Philip coughed, cleared his throat, and said in a smoke-abraded voice, "My mum died when I was 5. I hardly remember her, but I remember how my dad was before she died. He was a great dad. Taught me how to throw a ball, always showed me what he was working on when he fixed stuff, read me stories at night, but then after Mum died, my dad..." Philip paused when a keening sound sliced through the camp and speared both men. Bob's muscles were taut with fear and dread. Bob didn't think Philip was going to finish his story, but suddenly Philip said, "My dad got lost. He just got lost. He couldn't do anything for me anymore. He was all by himself. He turned into a horrid dad." Philip pushed off the swing set. He powered on his flashlight. Philip turned and looked Bob in the eye. "I've become just like him." Before Bob could respond, Philip turned off his flashlight and walked away. The night plucked him from Bob's reality and deposited him someplace beyond his senses. Bob was left standing alone with more self-knowledge than anyone would ever want to have. "That's enough," Bob said. He was going to stop the bunny call. Bob headed off into the woods, going into the general direction, he thought, of where the last two sounds originated. That same direction as the lodge. Maybe someone would be there, someone who could find Ralpho and cancel the Mackenzie bunny call. It was 100 yards or so to the lodge, but it felt much further as Bob attempted to follow, using only his small penlight, the gravel-covered path through heavy forest and past darkened cabins. He started at a walk, but he quickly shifted to a jog, hoping he wouldn't trip on a root or an errant bull or an oar. He couldn't afford to waste time. Ralpho could show up to the cabin nutter at any minute. For all Bob knew, Ralpho could be there now. When Bob broke through the last stands of trees at the edge of the open area in front of the lodge, his shoulders sagged. The lodge was completely dark. It was so dark it looked abandoned. That was crazy, of course. Someone had to be in there. Bob hesitated in the middle of the dew-drenched, slopping lawn. Should he pound on the lodge doors and wake someone up? A squall echoed through the trees. Bob whipped around to look back at the path he'd come down. He stopped thinking and simply went into action. Jogging again, he retraced his steps until he was about halfway to his cabin, his family. Then he heard a scuttling sound that froze his intestinal serpents and turned his spine to ice. Was that Ralpho? Bob aimed the narrow beam of his penlight into the underbrush of either side of the path. The pale white light landed on drooping leaves of a wild... Oh my... What is that? What is that? The pale white light landed on drooping leaves of a wild rhododendron. The plant seemed to be trembling. Surely Bob was imagining that. Of course he was. The wind was just stirring the slick green leaves. Or was it the wind? The leaves weren't moving in any direction that made sense. An abrupt explosion of snaps and crackles stirred up a rustling that seemed to move away at the right angle to the path. Without thinking about the consequences, Bob veered off the path and dove into the thick vegetation. He followed the sounds. Pop, crickle, ting. What was that sound? Bob stopped abruptly, losing his balance. He threw a hand out to catch himself, and he scraped his palm on rough bark. He turned off his penlight. He listened. There it was again. Barely there. A slightly metallic rattle. Was it a cymbal? Trying to make as little noise as possible, Bob started moving again, following the sounds. They moved steadily away from him, heading toward the edge of the camp, heading in the direction of Cabin Nutter. But not necessarily to Cabin Nutter. There are at least 5 other cabins around Cabin Nutter. Yeah, keep telling yourself that, Bob thought as he tracked the sounds through the forest. He was moving by feel now, afraid to turn on his penlight again. He had this insane idea that Ralpho was messing with him, playing a scary game of hide-and-seek. What was Bob dealing with? Was it a camp counselor with a sense of humour, or an animatronic with its circus crossed, or something more treacherous than either of those? Yep, it's that option. Bob forced his brain to power down its thinking centres and focus only on keeping his body in motion. He concentrated on where he was putting his feet. He ploughed through the forest the way Wanda mowed through shoppers in an after-Christmas sale. He had one goal: stop the orange rabbit. He would not be deterred from that goal. But wait. Bob halted next to a massive cedar. I know that's a word, and I've seen that word before. I have just never tried to say it. He listened and listened. He heard nothing. Absolutely nothing. Had he imagined all the sounds he thought he heard? Or was Ralpho done playing with Bob? What if Ralpho was getting close to Cabin Nutter? What if he was already there? Bob thrashed back to the path, and when he reached it, he turned on his penlight to illuminate his way. Then he ran flat out. Bob hadn't run since he was on the football team in high school. He jogged some, but he never stuck with it. So when he reached the cabin, he could barely breathe. All he could do was open the door and fall inside. Once there, he firmly shut the door and slid to the floor, his legs splayed out in front of him. He heaved to get air into his oxygen-depleted lungs. He was making so much sucking, gasping noises that he was nearly drowning out of his family's snores. Nearly, but not quite. The import of that hit him. They were still sleeping. All was well. Bob looked at his watch. It was only 5:25 a.m. Bob frowned. How was that possible? It felt like he'd been running around the forest for an hour at least. Bob shrugged. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was there. And Ralpho wasn't. The door behind Bob's back vibrated when a knock sounded. Bob whimpered. He stayed very still. Maybe if no one answered the door, Ralpho would go away. Another knock. This one louder. Bob got to his knees. He waited. Another knock. More insistent. Okay, playing possum wasn't going to work. Pretty soon, Ralpho would be pounding on the door and he'd wake up Bob's whole family. Wasn't that what he was trying to stop? Bob turned, grabbed the knob and opened the door a few inches. He looked out. It was all he could do to not scream. Ralpho had been startling to behold from across the huge lobby in the lodge. Close up, Ralpho was just plain alarming. Taking a half step back, Bob braced one foot behind the door, held the doorknob firmly, and blocked the opening with his body. Bob looked up at Ralpho's face. Yes. Up. Oh god. Too far up. It's just that sentence, Bob looked up at Ralpho's face. Yes, up. That's so well done. Ralpho was over 6.5 feet tall, just to the top of his head. His ears went up another foot or so, and speaking of his head, it was a disturbingly big head. Almost the size of me. Bob forced himself not to look away from Ralpho's eyes, even though they were an unsettling bright pink. Ralpho gazed down at Bob and waited. Ralpho, Bob's voice cracked like he was barely older than Tyler. He cleared his throat and tried again. Ralpho, I would like to respectfully request that we, cancel our bunny call. Ralpho didn't move. I'm sorry you came all the way out here, Bob continued, and, I appreciate your time, but I've decided a bunny call isn't the best thing for my family. Ralpho was immutable. So, like I said, Bob ploughed ahead. With due respect, we won't be needing your services. Bob held his breath. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. Ralpho slowly nodded, turned, and headed down the steps of Cabin Nutter. Bob shut the door, locked it, and leaned against it, sighing deeply. Tears filled in his eyes. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been so relieved. It was over. He had been able to fix his mistake after all. Bob sank to the floor again. He sat and listened to the snores. He made a mental note to record these sounds just before they left Camp Atenia. He might start using them to de-stress. Bob? Bob turned his head so fast he smacked it against the door. He heard Wanda shift on the double bed. Where are you? Wanda asked. Over here. Bob turned on his penlight and heaved himself to his feet. Why are you up? I'm not sure. Bob didn't shine his light at Wanda to see how his answer went over. He was hoping she was still mostly asleep. Wanda's brain didn't generally turn on fully until she'd been awake for a couple of hours. Could you aim your light at the bathroom? No need to turn on the light. On my light too. What time is it? Blankets and sheets rustled. The old box springs. under the double mattress squeak. Bob checked his watch again. It's 5:28. He aimed his light out in front of Wanda. It lit up enough of the room so that he could see she had her sleep mask pushed up on top of her head. She didn't look his way, which was a good thing because he had no idea how to explain why he was standing in front of the cabin door. Too early to get up, she said. Absolutely. Bob heard what sounded like shuffling footsteps outside the cabin door. His breath caught, and he tilted his head to listen. Maybe it was just a pine cone blowing across the porch. Maybe that was it. Wanda went into the bathroom and closed the door. No light showed under the door. He heard her doing her thing. But then he heard the shuffling again. Shh, pff, shh, pff, shh. It was too rhythmic to be a pine cone. Was Ralpho back? Bob pressed it back against the door. He couldn't have said why. Leaning on the door wouldn't prevent Ralpho from knocking, and if Ralpho knocked while Wanda was awake, the jig was up. Wanda came out of the bathroom, her gaze steady on the illuminated path of Bob's penlight. She didn't even look at him. Going back to sleep, Wanda said. Coming? Be right there, Bob said. I hope, he thought. Outside the door, the sound came closer. Shh, pff, shh, pff, shh, pff. Bob turned into a statue. He had no idea what he should do. Wanda got back in bed. Light, she said. He flicked off his penlight, and he heard her plump up her pillow. She exhaled in contentment. Something thudded softly against the door behind him. The door moved slightly. Bob shoved his back more firmly to the smooth wood. Wanda's snores joined the kid's snores. Next to Bob's hip, the doorknob jiggled. What the heck? Bob jumped back from the door and shined his penlight at the knob. He reached a hand out, preparing to grab the knob, fling the door open, and ask Ralpho or whoever was out there what he, she, or it thought they were doing. Before he could touch the knob, though, he felt something like a static shock, just a faint charge on the end of his fingertips. Bob knew it was a warning. He just knew it. Opening the door would be a very bad idea. Bob frowned. What? That was ridiculous. He was losing his marbles. Yes, someone was outside the door. Someone was trying the knob. But that someone was either Ralpho or another camper. Bob could handle either. Or could he? A metallic scratching sound came from the door. Bob bent over and listened. Someone was trying to pick the lock. Goosebumps erupted on Bob's bare arms. Ralpho, or someone, was trying to break into the cabin. What should he do? Bob looked around wildly. He needed... What did he need? A phone? No phones here. The bell. No, that wouldn't work. The bell was outside. It was outside and it was at the bottom of the porch. Bob would have to get past whatever was trying to break in to get the bell. A lot of good this emergency bell was. A weapon. Bob needed a weapon. He swept the cabin with his light. Of course it had no traditional weapons. No guns, no knives, no swords. This was summer camp, not boot camp. Not even a bat. His kids hadn't signed up for softball. His light landed on tennis rackets and fishing poles. Bob swallowed down a hysterical giggle when his brain offered up an image of him fighting off an orange rabbit with a tennis racket in one hand and a fishing pole in the other. Bob heard a clink and a clink. Well, he had to do something. Grabbing one of the ladder-back chairs tucked around the table, Bob tilted it and shoved it under the doorknob. Just in time. The door started to open, but it caught against the chair. Bob stared at the chair and the door, and he held his breath. Something thumped against the door, and the door moved inward an inch, shoving the chair across the smooth wood floor. Bob jammed the chair harder under the knob and felt it in place. This stopped the door's movement, but by now it was open 2 inches. Breathing fast, Bob shined his light into the gap. He leaned over to get a better look. The tip of a furry orange paw tried to slide through the opening. Bob jumped back. At the same time, he hissed, "Go away! I said I wanted to cancel the bunny call." Ralpho didn't seem to care what Bob wanted. He moved his paw back and forth in the door opening for several seconds. Bob prodded at Ralpho's paw with a penlight, wanting to push the paw back out through the door, but Ralpho tried to grab the light. Bob snatched the light back, then he hit Ralpho's paw with it. The paw wiggled a little, but didn't leave the opening, so Bob punched Ralpho's paw as hard as he could with his fist. Pain shot through Bob's knuckles, and he saw something dark and moist appear on the orange paw. Before Bob could figure out what he was looking at... Wait, something dark and moist? What? Before he could figure out what he was looking at, though, The paw retreated from the 2-inch space. Bob took a deep breath and let it out. Okay, maybe Ralpho would go away now. Bob checked the time. It was 5:36. Surely Ralpho would give up and go visit other cabins with standing bunny calls. Bob wondered if he could go back to his bed. His eyes felt like they were full of broken glass. How would he take part in camp activities for a day of no sleep? A whomp sounded from under the picture window. Bob whirled in that direction. Ralpho wouldn't try to come through a window, would he? Bob quickly aimed his penlight at the large rectangular glass covered opening across the table and chairs. He sucked in his breath when his light caught the shadow of a large misshapen head. "Oh no, 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 no," Bob whispered as he leaned over to the window. It was locked, wasn't it? The window started to open. No, it wasn't locked. Oh, that's actually the next sentence. Okay, brilliant. Or it was locked and Ralpho had managed to unlock it. Or locks were irrelevant to Ralpho, just as irrelevant as Bob's request that Ralpho go away. The window opened further and an orange paw reached through, then an ear. "Why don't you just stand here and watch? That's a good plan, Bob." Bob's sarcastic self-talk made a point. He needed to move, so he did. But as he lunged for one of the tennis rackets leaning up against the wall, he cut himself some slack. It was, after all, reasonable to be dumbfounded in the presence of a furry orange intruder. Both of Ralpho's ears and most of an arm were through the window by the time Bob started beating on the ears and arm with the tennis racket, careful to avoid missing the rabbit and hitting the window. Bob's defensive thwacks were relatively quiet. His family's snores didn't stop. Neither did Ralpho, apparently impervious to the blows. Ralpho kept reaching into the cabin. "Get out!" Bob whispered. Ralpho didn't respond. Bob looked at Ralpho's paw, which was just a few inches from Bob's chest. The paw was covered in blood. Oh! What? Blood? Bob stopped pounding with the tennis racket. He shined his light on Ralpho, whose head was now coming further into the cabin. Bob stared into Ralpho's disquieting eyes. "Are you okay?" Bob asked. Ralpho stared back at Bob. He didn't speak. Was this just a guy in a freaky rabbit suit? Ralpho wasn't real, was he? Ralpho's head slid a little further inside the cabin. Whatever Ralpho was, Bob couldn't let him in. So Bob shifted his grip on the tennis racket. Instead of hitting Ralpho more, he used the racket to shove at Ralpho's encroaching head. Grunting, he pushed against Ralpho with all his might. For a few seconds, Ralpho pushed back. It was like a bizarre tug-of-war in reverse. But Bob thought about his sleeping family, and that gave him the extra oomph he needed. Yeah, that's actually a scientific thing. You know, like when you're trying to save your family, you get stronger for a second. Ralpho fell back out of the cabin. Bob quickly but quietly closed and locked the window. Realizing he was breathing loudly, he took a few seconds to get control of himself. Blowing out a long muted breath, he was pleased when he no longer sounded like a train engine. How could Ralpho be bleeding? If Ralpho was a guy in a suit, why would he be willing to get injured to pull off a prank? Up until now, Bob's logical brain had been trying to tell him that the effort he was expending to keep Ralpho out of the cabin was beyond preposterous. Whoever was wearing or running Ralpho was being persistent, yes, but it was probably just part of some outrageous joke Campetenia's staff played on anyone with the audacity to try and stop the bunny call. Bob's sense of urgency, his conviction that he was battling a truly dangerous foe, was more than likely all in his head. But a bleeding Ralpho put a serious crimp in Bob's theory. What if Ralpho really did want to get inside the cabin and hurt Bob and his family? Maybe Bob was losing his mind, but then again, maybe not. The window on the left side of the cabin started to slide open. Bob moaned. He'd forgotten Wanda had opened that window. Bob charged over to the window. Just as Ralpho's bleeding orange paw began reaching through the opening, Bob slapped the window closed, catching the intruding paw. The paw bled more heavily, and it moved, reaching. Bob snatched up the tackle box sitting under the window and slammed the paw with the box. The contents of the box clattered, and the noise made Bob pause. The paw curled back toward the window, and Bob opened the window just enough to thrust the paw back outside with the end of the tackle box. He pushed the window closed and locked it. Bob shined his penlight around the cabin again. What would Ralpho do next? Come on, think, Bob admonished him. Oh my gosh. Admonished himself. thinking, though, was a bad idea. If he thought, he'd have to face the fact that it really was Ralpho, a very determined Ralpho, willing to bleed to reach his goal, trying to get into the cabin. What else would he want? Bob certainly did not want to think about that. Right now, every one of his instincts was telling him to keep Ralpho out at any cost. This had gone beyond trying to stop Ralpho from scaring his wife and kids. This was about stopping Ralpho, period. Bob couldn't have explained what was going on, even if someone had put a gun to his head and demanded he explain himself, but he just knew that there would be horrible consequences if Ralpho got inside the cabin. Bob tilted his head and listened. He realised he had no idea where Ralpho was. Was Ralpho still outside his window, or had he moved to a different one? Bob held perfectly still again and listened some more. At first he heard nothing. He checked his watch. It was 5:43. 17 minutes to go, Bob whispered, and one more window Ralpho can get through. Why was Bob just standing there? Outside, the rhythmic shuffling moved past the cabin door. The sound was moving away from Bob. Ralpho was heading toward the other window, the one right next to the double bed where Wanda slept. Bob knew he had to be sure the next window was locked, but he was rooted to the floor. Ralpho was almost to the edge of the front porch, about to turn the corner. Bob moved. He ran through the cabin as lightly as he could, passing his sleeping wife and daughter. Just as he reached the window, it started to move. Bob grabbed the edge of the window and tried to grab it. Ralpho kept trying to open it. Bob stuffed his penlight in his pocket and used both hands to force the window closed. He concentrated on keeping his breathing even and shallow. He didn't let himself grunt or groan in exertion. He just pushed the window closed when Ralpho pushed the window open. Stalemate. How long did Bob stand there, straining to close the window? It felt like hours, maybe days. Bob's muscles began to spasm. It felt like his biceps were filled with liquid fire spreading upward into his shoulders. He wanted to scream in pain and frustration. Outside, faint pre-dawn light was pushing away the blackness. Bob could make out Ralpho's gargantuan head and ears. Bob was just inches from his adversary. Only window glass separated them. Window glass and Bob's determination to protect his family. Bob closed his eyes and gave his effort everything he had. Suddenly the window slid shut. The snick of it latching into place seemed impossibly loud. Wanda stirred, but she didn't wake up. Weakly, Bob locked the window. Then he dropped his arms and shook them out. They felt like they'd turned into a pair of Cindy's flimsy jump ropes. Stepping away from the beds, Bob wiped at the sweat covering his face. He felt a ludicrous sense of accomplishment. A bump and a clatter came from underneath the cabin. Ralpho had moved on. Bob moved his penlight from his pocket and aimed it at the floor. The trapdoor! Oh no! Oh no! I knew the trapdoor would come into play at some point. Bob ran over to the trapdoor and he stood on it. He immediately felt like an imbecile. His weight alone wasn't going to be enough to keep the trapdoor closed, at least not if he was standing. Ralpho could easily throw Bob off balance by opening it. Would sitting on the trapdoor work? Bob sat down on the door. He listened to the bumps under the floor, growing ever closer. The closer they came, the more Bob thought about how big Ralpho was. Bob wasn't a tiny guy, but he was pretty sure whoever was in the Ralpho suit was strong enough to dislodge Bob from a trapdoor. And then what? What could he do now? He looked around, grasping for a solution. His gaze landed on the chest of drawers. Jumping up and running to the chest, he gave it a tentative shove. It was heavy, but it slid easily. The only problem was that the sliding sound was noisy. Cindy's snores paused for a second, and then restarted. Bob's gaze darted around the cabin. Think, think, think. He spotted the quilt lying, folding up, on the edge of the trundle bed. He mentally thanked Cindy for playing with it. If she hadn't, he probably wouldn't have noticed it. Grabbing the quilt, he lay it on the ground. Another bump and a scuffle from another cabin. Ralpho was almost to the trapdoor. Bob tilted the chest toward him, so it leaned on his side. He let it all the way down. I lost where I am. He let it all the way down to the floor on top of the quilt. Then he bent over, grabbed the edge of the quilt, and started dragging the chest toward the trapdoor as fast as he could. The trapdoor started to open. Bob jumped on the door. It closed with a snap that made Bob wince. But the snoring around him continued. He leaned back over and grabbed the quilt's edges, hauling the chest toward him as fast as he could. The trapdoor started to rise under his feet again. Quickly, he backed off of it and it pulled the chest onto the door. Then he turned the chest onto its back and he sat on it. The chest started to buck, and Bob felt like he was on some silent, malevolent amusement park ride. Was the combined weight of Bob and the chest of Jaws going to be enough? The chest bucked again, and Bob was nearly thrown off. He gripped both sides of the chest and hung on. Bob had never ridden a bull or a mechanical bull, and he wondered if it was like this. His head kept getting yanked around, and he'd have whiplash soon if Ralpho didn't stop. But Ralpho did stop. Scuffling sounds under the cabin moved away from the trapdoor and toward the outside wall. Bob slumped on the chest. Now was it over? Bob checked his watch. It was 5:56. 4 minutes. Just 4 minutes. Bob listened closely to the swishing and tapping sounds under the cabin. Ralpho was almost out from under the building. His whole family was still snoring, but Wanda shifted in the bed. Any of the kids could wake up soon, and Bob didn't want to leave the chest lying in the middle of the floor. After another few seconds of listening, Bob convinced himself Ralpho was no longer under the cabin, so he quickly pulled the chest back to the wall and righted it. He then made a half-hearted attempt to fold the quilt and dropped it on the edge of the bed. Then Bob thought about Ralpho's bleeding paws. Did any blood get inside the cabin, like on the tennis racket on the tackle box? Bob decided he didn't want to look. Instead, he trotted to the fridge and pulled off some paper towels from the roll Wanda had put on the top. He quickly wiped down both the tennis racket and the tackle box. Plus, he wiped down all windows and the floor beneath each one. Now, wanting very much to climb into bed himself, Bob waited. His instincts were telling him he had to stay alert. But why? The cabin was secure. Ralpho was retreating. A sudden rap drubbed against the back of the cabin. The back of the cabin? What was Ralpho doing there? Nothing was back there. No, wait! The loft window! Bob's stomach and heart switched places. He'd forgotten all about the loft window. Clamping his penlight in his teeth, Bob climbed the ladder up to the loft as fast as he could. Even through every step raised his dread meter higher. He really didn't want to climb up to the loft at all. If Ralpho was up there, Bob didn't know if he could handle it. But he had to. After all, his boys were also in the loft. When Bob's head reached the top of the ladder, he hesitated. Then he took a deep, shaky breath. He shined his light at the window on the far wall as he peered up to the loft. Bob's light revealed the upper half of Ralpho already through the window. Bob let out a choked cry. Thankfully, his astonishment cut off the sound in his throat, and the boys snored on. Gaping at Ralpho, Bob was momentarily paralyzed. This situation was far so beyond anything his mind could process that he felt fully and thoroughly shut down. All Bob could do was stare. But he had to move. He had to keep Ralpho away from his family. Why did he keep gawking? And suddenly, Ralpho paused in his climb through the window. He gazed back at Bob, and neither of them made a sound. Bob trembled and clutched the loft ladder so hard his hands throbbed. Outside, dawn arrived, and light shined around Ralpho's orange head, making him look for an instant like some kind of supernova monster. Bob was superglued to the ladder. He listened to his own uneven breathing, and Ralpho began backing out of the window. Ralpho retreated completely from his cabin. His head dropped below the level of the window. Then, silence. Silence all around. Bob closed his eyes and dropped his head to the top of the ladder, to the top step of the loft ladder. Dad? Abruptly, the cabin was filled with intense white light. The luminous intrusion into his consciousness felt so invasive that Bob blinked several times and tried to figure out where he was. It felt like he'd been transported to another, otherworldly place. Bob squinted. He recognized the wide-eyed face of his sleep-rumpled son. "What are you doing?" Aaron asked. He stood underneath the pull string to the exposed light bulb that now lit up the loft. Everything cascaded back into place. The bunny call, Ralpho, Bob's frenzied determination to stop the threat to his family. "What time is it?" Bob asked. "Huh? The time." Aaron picked up his cell phone from the nightstand. Really, the only function their phones had out here was a clock. "It's 6, Aaron said. Tears filled Bob's eyes. "Dad?" Aaron repeated. "What are you doing?" Bob ignored him. Now Tyler was sitting up, rubbing his eyes. "Mama, up!" Cindy's high-pitched voice demanded down below the loft. "Dad, why are you hanging onto the ladder?" Tyler asked. He threw back his covers and shifted to the edge of his bed. Bob didn't know if he could move. He felt like all his muscle had left his body. But he couldn't stay where he was. He didn't have the strength. So up or down? Up was closer. Bob climbed the rest of the way up into the loft, without answering Tyler's question, because he didn't know how to answer it. Bob collapsed next to Tyler. He motioned for Aaron to join them. Looking at his father as if he had grown a second head, Aaron slowly crossed to Tyler's bed. Bob patted the space next to his hip, and Aaron frowned but sat down. Tyler and Aaron exchanged a look. Then Bob reached around the back of the boys' necks and pulled them both close. He dropped his arms around their shoulders and squeezed them in a long, tight hug. He wanted to say something, but he was too emotional to talk. He just wanted to hold on to his boys, his precious boys, for as long as... "Dad, you're kind of squeezing the life out of us," Tyler said. Bob let up on the hug, but didn't let them go. He cleared his throat and got his voice to work. "I love you guys," he said. "So much." He looked at both of them in turn. Both boys had creases on their cheeks from their night's sleep. Their eyes were crusty, and they had sour morning breath. Bob didn't care. They were his sons. They were perfect. "You know how much I love you, right?" he asked them. Tyler and Aaron looked at each other again. Yeah?" Aaron said. "Yeah," Tyler agreed. "We love you too, Dad," Aaron said. A click came from the cabin's first floor, and more light blasted through the little building. Wanda was up. "Bob, what are you doing up there?" Wanda's scratchy, early morning voice sounded wonderfully normal. "Come on, boys," Bob said. The boys didn't move when Bob got up, but Bob grinned at them before heading down the ladder. What a wonderful morning. It was great to be alive. At the bottom of the ladder, Bob turned toward the double bed and scooped up his daughter from it. "Cindy Lee, my buzzy honeybee," he exclaimed before buzzing in her little ear. Cindy immediately began giggling hysterically. Then she put her arms straight out to her sides and instructed, "Fly, Daddy, fly!" Bob happily picked her up, and he ran around the room with her yelling, "Zoom goes the honeybee! Zoom, zoom, buzz, buzz!" Oh wait, no! That was the dad. That was Bob. Oops. "Zoom, zoom, buzz, buzz," Cindy repeated. Then she let loose with a high-pitched squeal of glee. "Bob?" Wanda said. She was standing by the bed in her bright yellow silk pajamas, her hands on her hips. "What?" he asked. "Something weird is going on." "What makes you say that?" Wanda frowned. "I have no idea." She shook her head. "I must have been having a strange dream." Cindy squealed again. Wanda looked at her daughter and at Bob. Her mouth dropped open and her eyes widened. Oh my god, her eyes widened. The bright light in the cabin brought out the reddish strands in Wanda's hair. Bob couldn't remember her ever being more beautiful. He flew his buzzy honeybee over to his wife, and he engulfed both wife and daughter in a long, tight hug. "I love you, I love you, I love you," he declared while Cindy said, "Buzz, buzz," and Wanda said, "What's going on?" Bob didn't answer her. He just squeezed. Be skished? Be squished. Oh, I see. Cindy said, "Ow!" Bob released them. He looked at their gorgeous faces, flushed and smiling. Admittedly, Wanda's smile was tentative, and it was mixed with what appeared to be confusion, but she was smiling. "Daddy, pee-pee," Cindy said. Bob set his daughter down. Wanda took Cindy's hand and led her into the bathroom. The second Wanda and Cindy were in the bathroom, Bob looked around the cabin, checking his blood cleanup. He didn't see anything he had missed. And what did he do with the paper towels he used? He checked his pockets and felt them there, but he didn't pull them out because Aaron and Tyler were coming down the ladder. Putting Ralpho out of his mind, Bob hugged his boys again. They tolerated the hugs for a few seconds until Tyler announced, "I'm hungry." "Hi, hungry. I'm Dad." The bathroom door opened. Cindy, her arms straight out from her sides, started buzzing again. Bob reached out and grabbed Wanda by the hand to pull her close. "It's a beautiful day and we're together. And we have lots to do today," he said, spinning Wanda into a dance around the cabin. Wanda laughed. "Who are you and what have you done with my husband?" Then she gave up and allowed him to sweep her up into the dance. Heading to breakfast at the main lodge, Cindy skipped ahead, but Bob held tight to Wanda's hand. The sun was already ascending into a beautiful, brilliant blue sky. I added beautiful into that. The evergreens' boughs were bright green in the morning light, and they seemed to be reaching toward that sky, as if in the celebration of the new day. Chickadees played in the forest undergrowth. Their phoebe calls joined with the few chuck cries of the western bluebirds Bob could see flitting through... What is happening? I have no idea what any of this means. A woodpecker added a rat-a-tat from a tree just out of view. On a low-hanging branch near the trail, a chipmunk chattered, "Sprick, sprick, sprick," as it fluffed its tail. Did that sound like a chipmunk? Probably not. Bob felt like he and everything around him had been cartooned. It all felt too colourful, too cheerful, too, well, cartoony. After everything that had happened the night before, he wouldn't have been surprised if the families around him broke into the song. Campetania was hopping this morning, as everyone was heading to the lodge for breakfast. Kids were running and playing as they went. Aaron and Tyler raced off to join some new friends in a game that involved a lot of shouting. Today, all the activity didn't bother Bob. He was still riding the high of his profound relief. "I take it you've decided this place isn't so bad?" Wanda asked. Bob grinned at her. "There are worse places. Much worse," Bob thought 15 minutes later as he sat down at the table with his family, eating his way through some of the thickest, tastiest pancakes he'd ever known. "Wow, what's in these?" he asked one of the camp employees who came by to top of his coffee. The perky grey-haired woman leaned over and whispered, "The secret is cinnamon and vanilla, but don't tell anyone I told you." She grinned and bustled off. Breakfast was being served in the main dining room, which, like the main lobby of the lodge, had a vaulted log ceiling and golden log walls. Bob appreciated that the room was filled with dozens of round tables so families could eat together instead of being forced to join everyone else at long communal tables. The only long table was the one at the front of the room, and it seemed to be reserved for the Campetania staff. Bob took another bite and watched his kids eat. Aaron and Tyler were stuffing as many pancakes in as they could, acting like they'd never have another chance to eat, ever. Cindy had both pancake and syrup smeared adorably all over their face. Around them, dozens of conversations filled the room with a lively hum that blended with the clinks and clatters of silverware and stoneware. The air was sweet with the aroma of maple and butter. Excuse me, the loud tink-tink-tink of a spoon hitting the side of a glass lowered the decibel level in the room part way. "Could I have your attention, everyone?" Bob and his family, and most of the other diners, looked toward the staff table. In the middle of it, a tall, tanned man with a beard waved at everyone. "Over here," he called. Bob recognized him from the picnic and the campfire the night before. Talking died down. A few more rustlings and murmurings gave way to the silence. Everyone looked at the man. "Remember me from last night? I'm Evan, the owner of Campetania, and your host. I hope everyone had a good first night." Bob tensed, but kept a smile on his face. Most everyone cheered. Good, Evan said. "Okay, a few announcements." Bob prepared to zone out. He figured Wanda would let him know whatever he needed to know. "First," Evan said, "regarding the bunny calls." Every cell in Bob's body went on a high alert. He tuned in. "My apologies to those who signed up for a bunny call," Evan said. They should apologize, Bob thought. The bunny calls couldn't be done this morning because the counsellor who usually does bunny calls overslept. Ralpho wasn't able to make his rounds today. Bob stared at Evan. "These are really great pancakes," Wanda said. "Aren't they, Bob?" Oh, I have the shivers. That really got me. That really, really got me. Oh my god. Wow. That is a good one. That's a really good one. I'm gonna need to think about this. Jeez. So obviously, if you don't get it, the guy said the bunny calls didn't happen this morning, even though for a whole hour straight Bob was trying to fight against the rabbit, against Ralpho. So how can you explain that? I mean, Ralpho didn't oversleep because he was trying to intrude the house. I'm very concerned. I don't understand really. Like, why Bob? Why Bob? What did Bob do? Bob signed up for a bunny call. Why was Bob the one chosen to be like this? I don't know. I really am not sure. Maybe it's something to do with the children. I don't know. If you guys have any theories or anything like that, please do tell me in the comments below. I will read every single one. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. Next time we are going to be doing In the Flesh, which I'm very excited about. That's a very nice title. And I will see you all later. Goodbye!